last year I had the opportunity to interview Ian McGilchrist, together with Jane Clark, the editor of Beshara magazine. And that interview was published in the magazine earlier this year. Now I have the very great honor to introduce Ian McGilchrist himself as our speaker this year. Now, as we all know, we are each of us unique. This is a point that Ian brings out in in the book, The Matter with Things. But although we are each unique, I think some people seem more unique than others. And Ian McGilchrist is one of these people. He has had a most extraordinary career, beginning as a literary scholar at Oxford University, and then switching to medicine, where he had a distinguished career as a psychiatrist and neurologist. Following the publication in 2009 of his book, The Master and the Emissary, he came to a much broader public attention. That book and his more recent book, The Matter with Things, have established him as a distinguished philosopher. And it's in that capacity, I think, that we are welcoming him here today. Well, as a philosopher, Ian has asked the question which probably most philosophers have asked, and probably each of us has also asked at one point: what exactly is this reality that we find ourselves thrust into? And he has gone about answering this question by first asking, well, how is it that we come to understand reality at all? The perhaps not unsurprising answer is that our brain has a role to play. But Ian has gone further and distinguished or recognized the fact that the brain has two hemispheres, and he has revealed that these hemispheres have rather distinct, if complementary, roles. Now, he goes into what exactly the roles are in great detail in his books, but very broadly, our left hemisphere is the one we use for seeking out details and particulars in the environment around us. We could say that with the left hemisphere, we zoom in. The right hemisphere, by contrast, we zoom out to see the bigger picture, to see the context. And it's only within the context that the details that we've seen through the left hemisphere begin to make sense, to come to have meaning. Now, Ian has shown that in the time and the society in which we live, the left hemisphere has come to dominate. And in doing so, it has given rise to the worldview with which all of us, I think, are familiar, and which is the generally accepted worldview, namely the mechanistic, materialistic, reductionist one. Ian has also argued that this worldview is not the best worldview. In fact, it can help explain why we are facing so many crises today. For example, the fact that we don't zoom out to get the context can explain why we have environmental crises. And it also suggests that unless we change our worldview, we're not going to solve these crises. So Ian's plea is that the right hemisphere should once again become the master, and through its dominance, a better worldview will arise. Much of the latter part of his most recent book is an explanation of what that worldview would be. It's a much richer worldview than the rather meaningless and impoverished one that the materialistic worldview offers us. In my review of his book, I tried to very briefly outline what metaphysics he was suggesting. Amongst the key points that I brought out were that he's suggesting that consciousness is absolutely foundational rather than matter. He also suggests that values are ontologically primitive, so that beauty, truth, justice are not constructs of the mind which we paste on to the reality that we see around us. He also suggests that relationships are more fundamental than the things which are related. He has also much to say about time, and in particular, he argues that Newton got it wrong. It's not motion that needs explanation. It's stasis, because reality is movement, process, flow, he also urges us to get in touch with the divine. Writing a review of such an enormous, magnificent book was a challenge, a worthy challenge, a rewarding challenge. And when I finished writing it, I submitted it to the journal, to the magazine, and it was published. When I read what I'd actually written when it was published, I realized that I'd overlooked something quite important. Because one of the main points that, or a very important point that Ian brings out in his book is the coincidence of opposites. And I did not highlight this in my review. So I personally am extremely pleased that Ian has chosen this as the subject for the lecture today. He will make good my omission, I'm sure. And so with this, I will hand over to Ian, Poilshe Ian, and we look forward to your lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those lovely words, Richard. And if we can just begin with the first slide, I'm delighted to be able to give this Beshara lecture. It's going to be a cooperation between me and Mike, who's going to be doing the slides. Now, the next slide shows the book, The Matter with Things, which I spent the last decade writing, published in November 21. And as Richard hinted, it's an attempt to answer the question who we are, what our lives are, what the cosmos is, and how these things relate. And in brief, I suggest that we've become mesmerized by a way of looking at the world which is that of the left hemisphere, which is simplified and reduced in the way that a map or a diagram or a theory stands in relation to the real world that is mapped, diagrammed, or theorized about. And we've taken this very scanty reality, this very simplified schema, as the truth, the reality of experience, and as such, I believe we are misunderstanding wholly our responsibilities to the world. And that word responsibility contains in it the idea of a reverberative relationship in which one calls to the other and the other responds. That's what responsibility is about. So I will cut to the chase because I haven't got very much time. The first part of the book is neuropsychology. The second part of the book is epistemology. What paths can we follow in trying to pursue some idea of what we can take to be true? And the third part of the book begins, it's a book about the structure of the cosmos, and it begins with a chapter on the coexistence of opposites, which is my topic today. And what I'm giving you today is just some small highlights taken out of that chapter. Now, the idea of the coexistence of opposites has been foreign to the Western mind, with some exceptions among mystics, for a couple of thousand years, really, since Aristotle suggested that a thing and its contrary couldn't both be true. And this idea is much better understood in Eastern societies, where there is the concept of yin and yang. So next slide, please. And you will be familiar with this symbol, the Taijitu, which shows yin and yang with their different qualities. What's special is that they make up a perfect circle, and that each one contains a little of the other in its structure. And so there's something rather nice about this that makes it more nuanced than it might otherwise be. However, there is no question that this idea is very important. It is something to do with the whole process of creation, the very drive of the cosmos. And this is, if you like, it seems to me, a drive towards individuation and distinguishing unique cases without separating them, so that the process of individuating and distinguishing doesn't involve separation, so that the integrity of the whole is preserved. And one image of this that I like is that of the unfolding of a bud. So the bud unfolds to display the deep structure, and in opening up, it doesn't destroy itself. It actually fulfills itself by the process of outfolding. And I think that that's a good image to go with for the way in which the cosmos works. Now, after those initial notices of high level or almost mystical conceptions, I will go right down to the ground level and say, why is this a question that's important to us in the world we see immediately around us? So can I have the next slide, please? Next click. Okay, our everyday world. So I'm going to go down to our everyday world and build back up again to the more mystical realm. And what I'd suggest that we can probably all see is that as a society, we pursue happiness and become measurably less happy over time. We're the most miserable people that have ever existed in the time that we've been measuring it. We privilege autonomy and end up bound by rules to which we never assented, and more spied on than any people since the beginning of time. We pursue leisure through technology and discover that the average working day is longer than ever and that we have less time than we had before. Nowadays, things that used to be solvable with a 5-minute telephone call can involve MC Escher-like loops in which one goes round and round something on the internet for a few hours before giving up and trying to find a telephone number where one talks to somebody in probably the subcontinent of Asia who has an algorithm to follow and therefore answers in the way that a machine would answer. The means to our ends are ever more available, while we have less sense of what our ends should be or whether there's a purpose in anything at all. Economists carefully model and monitor the financial markets in order to avoid any future crash. They promptly crash. We are so eager that all scientific research result in what's called positive findings that it has become progressively less adventurous and more predictable, and therefore discovers less and less that is truly significant. And it doesn't aid advance in scientific thinking in the way that it once did. We grossly misconceive the nature of study in the humanities as utilitarian in order to get value for money, and thus render it pointless, and in this form, certainly a waste of resource. We improve education by dictating curricula and focusing on exam results to the point where free thinking, arguably an overarching goal of true education, is discouraged. In our universities, many students are, in any case, so frightened that the truth might turn out not to conform to their theoretical model that they demand to be protected from discussions that threaten to examine the model critically, and their teachers, who should know better, in a serious dereliction of duty, collude. We over-sanitize and cause vulnerability to infection. We overuse antibiotics, leading to superbacteria that no antibiotic can kill. We make drugs illegal to protect society, and while failing comprehensively to control the use of drugs, we create a fertile field for crime. We protect children in such a way that they cannot cope, let alone can't cope with uncertainty or risk, and are rendered vulnerable. The left hemisphere's motivation is control. It is the part of the brain that controls the right hand with which we do the grabbing, the grasping, the getting, and it only sees the straight path to getting more of something. It doesn't understand the big picture. And its means of achieving its goal is alarmingly linear, a point that I will come back to at various points during the talk, as though it could see only one of the arrows in a vastly complex network of interactions at any one time, which is all it can. Moving out a little, there are 2 points to make. One of them's just gone up on the screen. Similarity deceives. The Greeks have a saying I rather like: when God builds a church, the devil builds one right next door. And we need to be aware of lookalikes, because they are the dangers, and Puritanism is one that presents itself as self-righteous, as the only true path. It brooks no opposition. It drives out art, music, laughter, all the things that help us towards wisdom and pretends that it is the only path to spirituality, I believe its motivation is very far from benign. And next line, please. Not acknowledging the dark side causes actual harm both in the individual psyche and in society. So it leads to tyranny in the private sphere. I've often had to try to explain to somebody who couldn't accept that they were imperfect and had a dark side, that their attempt to project this idea of caring for everybody and getting everything right ended up tyrannizing an entire family and achieving the opposite of what they wished. So accepting the dark side, as Jung pointed out, is an extremely important aspect of spiritual maturity. And it leads also to extremism and ultimately tyranny in the public sphere. So we don't see the dark side of what it is we're currently advocating, though of course it exists, and instead we promote it at the cost of everything else. And in life, the good things are not ever as good as they're said to be. They carry hidden dark elements with them, and the things that are despised and we attempt to eliminate from our lives might teach us things that are important. So moving up from there to what I'm calling intermediate reflections. Next slide, please. The first thing is extent. So the extent to which a truth is a truth. Truths are only really ever half true because it depends on in what situation, to what end, in what context, for which person. And so as Whitehead put it, there are no whole truths. All truths are half truths. It's trying to treat them as whole truths that plays the devil, says he. To have seen it from one side only is not to have seen it. Moving down, that leads nicely to the idea of context. Context makes a huge difference to everything that you're looking at. And one of the things that I'd want to emphasize is that when we argue about values, it's often the opposition of standpoints. And from different standpoints, we see a different context and we see something quite different from what the other person may be speaking about. To give you a very simple example of how context can actually reverse the meaning of something, I sometimes refer to the size of cereal packets in America. There are basically four. There's jumbo, which means very large. Then there's economy, which means large. Then there's family, which means medium. And finally, there's large, which means small. So the context can change completely the meaning of a word or phrase. And it's extremely perilous in an age in which we're very good at taking sound bites and quotes from people out of context, and the context might have made them appear very different from the one they seem to be when they're decontextualized. And then there's the next line, please, the effects of perspective. So famously, Heraclitus proclaimed that the way up is the way down. And of course, it's true. The way up the hill from where I live is also the way down when I come back. To have seen it from one side only is not to have seen it. And in a way that you can never see all of anything. Our vision is partial, not in the sense that we only go part way to seeing it and there's some kind of a wall between us and reality. I don't believe that at all. I think what we see is the real deal. It's just that we can only ever see one part of the whole picture. And that's not a criticism, that's a necessary part of being a living individual. Now I want to move on from these rather adventitious reflections to the more foundational reflections. And the first of these is necessary coexistence of the good and the bad in whatever way we think of it. You can put up the next slide because it illustrates this quite nicely. Every angel has his devil. This is, of course, a famous picture by M.C. Escher. And at first you probably see the pictures of the devils with their bat-like wings, but in between them you can see the entire space is occupied by an angel. And I often say that every angel has his devil, and every devil has his angel. I'd like to quote Jung here on what he called enantiodromia, which just means the tendency of things to change into their opposites. The grand plan in which the unconscious life of the psyche is constructed is so inaccessible to our understanding that we can never know what evil may not be necessary in order to produce good by enantiodromia, and what good may very possibly lead to evil. I see that very forcibly in the world surrounding me now. An interesting example to me was the concept of the keystone species. Sometimes there is a predator in an environment that you think the environment might flourish if you took the predator out of it. On these grounds, the wolves were killed off in Yellowstone Park in the 1930s, and it was expected that the rest of the biosphere there would flourish. But in fact, the number of elk, which the wolves prey on, diminished. And they rather grew in certain areas, but were not allowed to move, not made to chase on to somewhere else. And so they stripped away the willows, which were important for the beavers, which created the dams in the streams, which caused, etc., etc., etc. So since about the 1990s, I think, wolves have been reintroduced in Yellowstone, and the number of elk have gone up, the number of willows have gone up, the beavers have returned, and so on. So this idea of the necessity of a predator it complicates our idea of what is necessarily benign or not in a complex system. And also at bottom, we recognize that there are things that are absolutely incompatible, but we need a bit of both of them. So, for example, in order to make children free, free thinkers, we need to indoctrinate them into the power of reasoning. In order to have freedom in a society, we need to have a set of rules by which people are willing to abide, and so on. William Empson, the critic and poet, wrote, and he wrote this in his 20s, I think, extremely often in dealing with the world, one arrives at two ideas or ways of dealing with things which both work and are needed, but which entirely contradict one another. And I'd say we all experience this at every level, from the most innocent, the trivial seeming, to the most sublime. We need universality and particularity, precision and flexibility, restriction and openness, freedom and constraint simultaneously. Everything flows from the pairing. We say we lose ourselves and consequently find ourselves in music, dance, or contemplation of a beautiful painting or landscape. Then there is, can we have the next slide, please? The notion of, you'll have to, yeah, and another one. Next line. Yeah. The concept of co-creation, which is an even tighter binding. So, for example, the co-creation could be, I mean, it's a concept, of course, in Buddhism, and I think a very deep one, but it can be thought of in terms of a bar magnet. You cannot have the North Pole of a magnet only. You must have the South Pole. If you don't like the South Pole and you saw it off, all you have is a shorter dipolar magnet. Each gives rise to the other. And what's more, they're not entirely separable. There isn't a neat margin where the North Pole stops and the South Pole begins that we can specify exactly. As Alan Watts said, we can't have mountains only and no valleys. These opposites are mutually sustaining, inseparable, and intertwined. The profound idea here is, again, for me, an insight of Whitehead's, that first of all is in process, and therefore the whole cosmos is continually in process. And I'm a process philosopher. I believe that the things we call things are actually processes, and in calling them things, we make them sound separate and static. Whereas if we thought of them as processes, we would see that nothing is static or ever unconnected with everything else. But his profound idea was that God, or the ground of being, and the cosmos that was underwritten by that ground of being, or brought into being by that God, in a way evolved together. It's complicated in the case of God because God can be both transcendent and eternal and part immanent in the creation, and thus, as it were, unfolding like the flower what was in and coming to know itself more fully in the process of creation. And this idea can be thought of as complementarity. The idea of complementarity is foundational in the natural world. So, for example, to turn one's back on the parts, the workings of the left hemisphere, which analyzes and breaks things up into fragments, and accept only the whole, the vision of the right hemisphere in which everything is connected, embodied, flowing, changing, and contextualized, is not to get back to wholeness, because the whole is never an annihilation, but rather a subsuming of the parts. The true whole exists precisely in this relationship, the tension between parts and an apparent whole. I'm going to complicate that slightly in the next. So can you click again, please? Yes, that was right. Fractality. Here I want to suggest that, again, it's a question of point of view, what is a part and what is a whole. I think that everything we can call a part is a whole at another level, and that everything we call a whole could be seen as a part of something greater. And it's this nested nature of reality, which Arthur Koestler called holons, these wholes that are not fully accounted for by anything that constitutes them, but are a whole at a new level that contributes to a whole at another level. This idea of fractality is very interesting because what it shows is that the same element that is there in the whole is also there in the part as you go down. And so you've got like a nest of Russian dolls. You've got the same pattern being worked out at different levels. Can you click again, please? And this should begin to move. Yes, it is. That's good. Just to illustrate this idea of fractality that I'm sure you're very used to, and it's now seen to be a very important element in our mathematical and physical understanding of the cosmos. Next slide, please. So there are further points I need to make. I think we've had that. So next, please, and the next, and the next, and the next. That's it, energy. So energy is very interesting. Where is energy? It's a very hard thing to say where energy exactly is. It forms fields, we know, and these fields can collapse and extend. But let's just go back to very simple things like household electrical goods. Where is the electricity in a circuit? Is it in the positive terminal? No. Is it in the negative terminal? No. Is it then just in the space between the terminals? No. It's in what happens when you put the positive and negative terminals together and something new evolves, which has extraordinary power. And so, in a way, I'd like to say that this is the structure of the world, that the coming together of things leads to something else at another level that was somehow implicit in it. And this is the same as the north and south poles of the magnet, whereas the magnetic power, it's not in one or the other, it's in the whole. And in a quite different sense, you can think of it as the merging of male and female gametes in the origin of new life. And of course, if you've ever actually seen a cell dividing, you'll be familiar with this astonishing, awe-inspiring dance that is conducted within the cells by the chromosomes dividing. And it looks for all the world like a field of iron filings moving under the power of a magnet, as it happens. William Blake wrote, "Without contraries is no progression." In other words, power comes from contraries. Attraction and repulsion, Reason and energy, love and hate are necessary to human existence. Those were all the words of Blake. And even in heaven, Blake believed there must be grief as well as joy, because you couldn't have meaningful joy unless there was something that was a part of its opposite also present. And in verse, he wrote, "It is right, it should be so. Man was made for joy and woe. Joy and woe are woven fine, a clothing for the soul divine. Under every grief and pine runs a joy with silken twine." So this kind of contrariness or contradiction or coincidence of opposites can be seen in all kinds of ways, threaded through the structure of the world, some of them at a more superficial level, some of them at a deeper level, and reaching down into the territory of the soul. The American philosopher Jacob Needleman wrote, "Stay with the contradiction. If you stay, you'll see that there's always something more than two opposing truths. The whole truth always includes a third part, which is the reconciliation." Remember that, because I want to come back to that in a short while. One very homely way of thinking of it is to make a good apple pie. You don't want bland apples. You need very tart, sour apples and extremely good honey. And the combination is absolutely irresistible. And I think that's important, because a lot of people think that the business of holding the opposites is to allow them to collapse into a sort of tepid midpoint between the two extremes. And this is not the case. What you often need is to hold the tension between them and see what comes out of it. Now, if we could have the next slide, please. This is a quote from, I think, with no exception, the greatest of Greek philosophers, a pre-Socratic philosopher, Heraclitus, who's taught me more than probably any other philosopher in my lifetime. He says, "They do not understand how a thing agrees at variance with itself. It is an attunement." The word he uses in Greek is harmonia, or actually harmonie, because of the dialect he wrote in. "It is an attunement turning back on itself, like that of the bow and the lyre." Next slide, please. And here I just wanted to put up these two images. The point is that the tension of the string in the lyre being pulled in opposite directions at once is what gives it the power to let fly the note. It's the tension in the bow pulling the string apart that creates the tension that allows the arrow to fly forth. And you might well say in a logical way, but what's the point in pulling something in two opposite directions? Why not save energy and just allow it to sit? The answer is no creation, no arrow, no note of music from the lyre. Harmonia is also a very interesting concept in itself. He probably meant three things by it. One was the fitting, or at this time at any rate in Greek, it could be used to mean the fitting together of surfaces that are true, as we carpenters will say, if two surfaces or two points of a joint meet correctly, that they are true, or even that they marry, which is rather wonderful. It can also mean the reconciling of warring parties, and it can also, of course, mean the accord of musical strings. And I think all three of these are present in this rich idea of harmony. Unison is when there is just one voice, or everyone is taking the same voice. Harmony is the beautiful coming together of the right differences, not just any old differences. Next slide, please. Yes, this is the densest and probably the richest of all Heraclitus's epigrammatic utterances. Graspings, the Greek word is silipses. Wholes and not wholes. Convergent, divergent. Consonant, dissonant. From all things one, and from one thing all. Now, that's about as deep as it gets, really. The Greek word graspings, I mean, it's not a perfect translation of silipses, but seems, according to Charles Kuhn, who's, I think, Heraclitus's most rewarding commentator, to suggest several ideas. Something grasped, perhaps suggesting the sudden comprehension of a gestalt, something that comes in an intuition, something that brings elements together, and fertility. For example, Aristotle uses the word to mean the sexual generation of life. It's hard to overestimate the richness then of this fragment. It says many things at once, that a deep understanding of the nature of reality comes in glimpses or graspings, moments of insight, that in that insight all is neither simply single nor simply manifold, neither simply whole nor simply not whole, neither simply like nor simply unalike, each thing working with and by the same token against the other, that the one and the many bring one another forth into being, together generating the reality that has this structure at its core, and that despite, or in light of all this perhaps because of, the nature of this multiplicity, all is held together in a solipsis, the only word here not to be paired with an antithesis. And the whole saying is in itself a solipsis, if you like. It's a gathering which in its fertility births a solipsis, a moment of dawning insight for us. This opposition of what was what he called Apollo and Dionysus was behind Nietzsche's philosophy that each gives birth to the other and both are necessary. This is very relevant in thinking about the brain hemispheres as it happens, but I haven't got time to go into that in much detail now. So there's a holding together of opposites, not the collapsing of them. Opposites genuinely coincide while remaining opposites. Some philosophies tend to collapse into the monism that opposites are identical, others into the dualism that opposites remain irreconcilable and are merely at most juxtaposed. The important perception is that opposites not only coexist, but give rise to and fulfill one another. Niels Bohr, when he was ennobled by the Danish government for his absolutely groundbreaking work in quantum physics, chose as his motto, contraria sunt complementa, contraries complement or fulfill one another. And he also actually took the sign of the Taijitu, the Yin Yang symbol that we started with, as the core of his coat of arms. And they're conjoined like the poles of a magnet without any intervening boundary, while nonetheless remaining distinct as opposites. Now, can we move on, please? I want to say something about, yes, that's all right, we've dealt with that. And the next one, and the next one, and the next one, and the next one, deep structure. The deep structure of reality. Well, I mentioned the name of Niels Bohr there, and he said something very interesting. It is the hallmark of any deep truth that its negation is also a deep truth. And he contrasted that with simple truths like whether I had milk in my coffee at breakfast. I mean, either I did or I didn't. There's no two ways about it. But as you get deeper into the fabric of reality, you find this what looks to the left hemisphere paradoxical element, that a thing and its opposite come closer to one another. And another great philosopher of the pragmatic, or pragmatist, I should say, tradition, C.S. Peirce, an American philosopher who, along with William James, was one of the most important philosophical influences in the late 19th and early 20th century. C.S. Peirce said, "A thing without oppositions ipso facto does not exist. Existence lies in opposition." So we are all, in a way, taut strings, relationships between points that vibrate, that reciprocate, that reverberate, and out of that comes the creative thisness that is each one of us. Now, this brings me to talk about shapes. I think we might need to move on a slide. Yes. So Heraclitus also said this famous thing, or is reportedly reported as saying, everything flows, which is not quite the same as the Buddhist idea that everything changes. It includes that, but it makes an important distinction between the large spread of the idea of change and the rather specific idea of flow. So it's not just that one thing ceases to exist and another thing comes about, but that there is a seamless evolution that is like the evolution of a personality over time, or the evolution of a melody or a leitmotif in Wagner, that it keeps on flowing, it keeps on changing, and everything has this important structure. And I like this when it comes to the idea of the difference between individuality and the general, because I believe that individuality is not set against the general, but is something through which we can see the general. And I like to mention this image of the early 19th century philosopher Schelling, who refers to a whirlpool in a stream. The whirlpool is not in the water in a way that a stone is in the water, or somebody might toss a ball into the water. The whirlpool is the water. It's not in it. It is the water for a time being. And it's very real. It's photographable. It can move stones. It's a definite force. It's measurable. But it's only part of the water for a while, and the water flows on and does something else. And I believe that each one of us could be seen as every living thing, or perhaps everything could be what we call a thing, could be seen as a whirlpool or something of this kind within the overall ocean of consciousness. And Democritus said a number of unwise things. He started the baleful story of atomism, but he also did say, with a great deal of insight, the cause of coming into being of all things is the vortex. And I'd like just to show you some slides and comment on them briefly. So next one, please. So here you see that vortex, and you see that it has a depth. So it goes down or deeply into the screen, but it also moves round. And it is this round motion and the elongated motion that I want to draw your attention to. Next slide, please. And you probably know the words of T.S. Eliot in the Four Quartets. I think it's in Little Gidding, I might be wrong, where he says, you know, the end of all our traveling is to arrive back at the place we started from and know it for the first time. And that, of course, makes progress sound circular, whereas I believe that the reality is that we can't come back to the place we started from because it's gone. Time has moved on, we have changed. And so where we are is, if you like, on the same curve, but further up the spiral. So we've come round to the point, but we are moving upwards as well as around as we go. And that progress in all things could be better imaged as neither simply following a straight line, which is extremely poor image of how most things develop, nor just as moving in circles. I mean, lots of civilizations have thought that time moves in circles or cycles. Indeed, Nietzsche thought that as well. But what I'm suggesting here is it's more like a spiral staircase in which you can look down on where you were before, and you can see upwards to where you're going. And now, if you wouldn't mind just bringing back the next slide, which is an illustration by Blake of Jacob's ladder. I've never seen an illustration of Jacob's ladder that isn't just a linear step ladder, and it's rather wonderful to see this idea that the progress from earth to heaven and from heaven coming down to earth is of the nature of a spiral where we pass over where we were. And as you can see in the picture, it goes on infinitely far into the distance. Next slide, please. Yes, as you know, waves and particles are considered to be two possible ways of looking at the deep structure of matter, and something that is a wave can collapse into a particle. And I want to suggest to you that, as well as this very interesting finding having a particular meaning for physicists, it also is an echo of what I'm just saying, because if you look at a wave function, and I've taken this from a physics textbook at the bottom here of a wave function, it's also exactly what a spring or a coil would look like viewed from the side. But also, if you look down it, you see what's on top of the picture there, which is the perfect circle. And so in a way, that spiral has, from a very particular viewpoint, the nature of a finite, or well, not a finite circle, because circles are infinite in the sense that you can progress around them forever. But if you see what I mean, that it's not moving anywhere in depth, it's staying where it is, whereas the other doesn't show the circular movement, but shows the wave movement. And that is an interesting pairing for me. I'd like the reflections of physicists on it. Next, please. Yes, and here you see a ripple in a stream, and you can see that it's almost like the Yin and Yang symbol, that there are these two overlapping parts in the flow that pull in contrary directions, but are part of the flow that moves together. Next slide, please. Yes, and this is something to do with the creativity of negation, which is a point I'm going to come to. These are the patterns made in a uniform flow in a rigid tube by inserting rods, I think, of cylindrical or hexagonal, not hexagonal, quadrilateral cross-section into the flow. And what comes is this rather unforeseen shapes, not exactly what everyone would anticipate. Next slide, please. Ultimately, you get something called a Karman vortex street, which is imaged here, and it starts from simply a disturbance that is put into the flow, and that can be a very simple disturbance. Next slide, please. In fact, Leonardo, what did Leonardo not know, saw this when he was watching movement in water, and he shows this sort of braided effect of things coming and going and intertwining after an old man allows his stick that he's leaning on to go into the water, and he draws the shapes that come out in the flow. Next slide, please. Yes, and what we see here is the necessity of resistance. I mean, again, from the simple point of view, resistance is just something we would like to do without, but it's actually very important. And the trouble with most of our images are that they are of progress along a linear path, and if there's anything that kind of interrupts it or opposes it, we should get rid of it. And I just want to read quickly this passage from Friedrich Friedensreich Hundertwasser, an Austrian painter and architect. In 1953, I realized that the straight line leads to the downfall of mankind. But the straight line has become an absolute tyranny. The straight line is something cowardly, drawn with a rule, without thought or feeling. It is a line which does not exist in nature. And that line is the rotten foundation of our doomed civilization. The straight line is atheistic and immoral. The straight line is the only sterile line, the only line which doesn't suit man as the image of God. The straight line is the forbidden fruit. The straight line is the curse of our civilization. Any design undertaken with the straight line will be stillborn. Today, we are witnessing the triumph of rationalist know-how, and yet at the same time, we find ourselves confined and confronted with emptiness, an aesthetic void, desert of uniformity, criminal sterility, loss of creative power. Even creativity is prefabricated. We've become impotent. We are no longer able to create. That is our real illiteracy. Well, as you gather, he wasn't a fan of the straight line. And I think we are all tyrannized by this thought that things should be most effectively pursued in a straight line. And I had a correspondent with a Swiss politician, Lucas Fierz, who recalled that as a boy he met his celebrated neighbor, Carl Gustav Jung. In the course of conversation, Jung, quote, told us about his encounter with a Pueblo chief whose name was Mountain Lake. The chief told him that the white man was doomed. When asked why, the chief took both hands before his eyes and, Jung, imitating the gesture, moved the outstretched index fingers convergingly forwards to one point, saying, because the white man looks at only one point, excluding all other aspects. Many years later, Dr. Fierce, who is a physician and a founding member of the Green Party in Switzerland, recalls that a significant adversary of that movement, the Green movement, was a successful industrialist and self-made billionaire. He says, I asked him what, in his view, was the reason for his incredible entrepreneurial and political success. He took both hands before his eyes and moved the outstretched index fingers convergingly towards one point before him, saying, because I'm able to concentrate on only one point, excluding all other aspects. I remember that I had to swallow hard 2 or 3 times so as not to say anything. So to return to this, the idea of necessary resistance, a lovely quote from the great romantic poet, German poet Friedrich Hölderlin, the heart's wave would never have risen up so beautifully in its cloud of spray and become spirit were it not for the grim old cliff of destiny standing in its way. And there's something important about the nature of matter in creation. I think in his introduction, Richard mentioned that I believe that consciousness is foundational. And it's not that I don't think matter is also foundational, it's that I think that matter is simply a form that consciousness can take under certain circumstances. So we don't know that we have consciousness because of matter. We might or might not. But what we do know is that we know matter only because of consciousness, and it's an element in consciousness that nobody's seen. All they've seen is phenomena in consciousness that have the nature we describe as material. What is that nature? It does a couple of important things. It allows something to persist for longer than it would otherwise persist, and it makes it more, if you like, a drag on whatever the process is. It resists the process of creation. But out of that resistance comes all the beauty that we know. So I believe that matter is a very important aspect of creation, but it is only a certain way of consciousness being. And people say, well, it doesn't look like consciousness. Well, of course it doesn't. Ice doesn't look like water. The water in the atmosphere in this room doesn't look like a stream. Consciousness can take different forms. And of course, when you think about something coming into being, what defines it is its boundaries. In fact, defining means setting edges or ends to it. And there's something very important here. There's the nature of opposition in creation. For example, friction. What is friction? Friction is what stops motion. We all know that. But it's also what starts motion. Without friction, I would be unable to move. So these things have dual qualities. And just think about the eardrum. The eardrum is a blockage in the passage of sound, but it's the effects on the eardrum that allow us to hear. And if the eardrum is missing or punctured, we can't hear. I hope I've just got time to talk very briefly about something that's rather fun, which is hormesis. There is something called Biosphere 2 in America, which I think is the largest artificial covered environment in the world. And it was developed by scientists to contain fauna and flora and to see how they would get on in an entirely protected environment. One of the things they noticed that puzzled them was that trees never reached their full growth, but fell over when they were still not yet mature. And what they came to realize was that a tree needs wind, it needs opposition, it needs a storm to blow on it, and this causes it to create the core wood that is its strength. Of course, again, Nietzsche was there before the scientists. He says, examine the lives of the best and most fruitful people and peoples and ask yourselves whether a tree which is supposed to grow to a proud height could do without bad weather and storms, whether misfortune and external resistance, whether any kinds of hatred, jealousy, stubbornness, mistrust, hardness, greed and violence do not belong to the favorable conditions without which any great growth, even of virtue, is scarcely possible. And you well know that medicines are often poisons. Everything depends on the dosage, as Paracelsus said. So I think there is a reconciliation. Next slide, please. And in this thought, I'm going to conclude. There is an innocence, the other side of experience, a knowledge, the other side of unknowing, a wisdom, the other side of folly. We have to go through its opposite for it to be fully realized. The innocence of a child is fine, but it's much less powerful and fulfilled than the innocence of a saint. Oliver Wendell Holmes, a rather down-to-earth American jurist, said, "The only simplicity for which I'd give a straw is that which is on the other side of the complex, not that which has never divined it." And here you may well know the famous Zen saying that's attributed to Dogen: "Before I sought enlightenment, the mountains were mountains and the rivers were rivers. While I sought enlightenment, the mountains were not mountains and the rivers were not rivers. And after I attained enlightenment, the mountains were mountains and the rivers were rivers." On this, James Campbell writes, I think, a good observation. "I think there are three states of being. One is the innocent expression of nature. Another is when you pause, analyze, think about it. Then, having analyzed, there comes a state in which you're able to live as nature again, but with more competence, more control, more flexibility." And this exactly reflects, I believe, the proper reciprocal function of the two brain hemispheres. Can you just click the next slide, please? Yes, this is just to show the two brain hemispheres, vestigially connected at the base by the corpus callosum, the band of fibers in the middle there, which has an L on it. The left hemisphere on the viewer's right has been drawn aside slightly so that you can see it. And I believe the way the hemispheres work is the right hemisphere sees the whole, the left hemisphere then takes it, analyzes it, categorizes it, loses its uniqueness, loses its integrity. And all that is very helpful if, once again, it is re-embraced by the right hemisphere into a now more complex, more rich whole. And this is like learning a piece of music. You first are attracted to the piece of music, you try to play it, you realize you have to take it apart, you have to practice a certain bar over and over again, you see the harmonic structure, but when you go back on the stage to perform, you must forget all of that, or you won't perform well. And that's not because what you did was a waste of time. It was very important. It was a stepping stone. In other words, the opposite is always a means to the greater good. But see that these are not symmetrical, that the right hemisphere is the master. It's more important than the left hemisphere. Once the left hemisphere thinks it's the master, then we are in for trouble. And I believe that's where we're at today. There's, I think, a relation between the brain and the cosmos. I mean, either the brain is structured like this because the cosmos is, and its job is to try and give us some idea of it, or the cosmos looks like this because the brain is the one that has allowed us to experience it. But I think, as Rowan Williams once said when I was in a public discussion with him, I don't think it matters, because I absolutely agree with him. They both stem from the same place. So next slide, please. Next line. There is a force for division and a force for union, and we need both of these. They both play an important role. Next. But what we need is not just the force for division and the force for union in a symmetry. At a meta level, we need them to be unified. So, if you like, unity trumps difference at a higher level. We need the unity of difference and unity. And that's the first asymmetry. There are many others. I haven't got time to go into them, alas. Move on. Next slide, please. So again, and this is from a physicist who's in fact professor of physics at Cambridge, David Tong. At a fundamental level, is nature discrete or continuous? I see no evidence whatever for discreteness. All the discreteness we see in the world is something which emerges from an underlying continuum, like the right giving its way to the left. But in the end, it goes back to the vision of the right hemisphere, the union. Quanta are emergent. They're not built into the heart of nature. Next slide, please. So we need sameness and difference, difference within sameness and sameness within difference. Next slide, please. Or next line. This is a quote from Goethe that I love. Dividing the united, uniting the divided, is the very life of nature. This is the eternal systole and diastole, that's the two beats of the heart, the eternal coalescence and separation, the inhalation and exhalation of the world in which we live and where our existence is woven. A wonderful word. Next slide, please. Could well be there. Yes. This is really just to show how even when forms have sameness about them, we know before looking what structure a snowflake will have at one level. We can't predict the exact structure of that individual. Every one of these is unique and beautifully reflects in each part the other parts. Next slide. And even here at the heart of life, you see here the male and the female sex chromosomes, the X and Y for the male and the X and X for the female. There is sameness and there is difference, and there is difference that includes the sameness. And in some beautiful way, this sets up both togetherness and apartness, and the result is the creation of a new life. Next slide, please. Yes, and that's really the end of what I have to say. I had hoped to talk a bit about the corpus callosum, but I won't. I'll see if somebody wants to speak about it. But I have to say these words. The principle for division and the principle for union need to be brought together, not divided. We need not non-duality only, but the non-duality of duality and non-duality. And in terms of the hemispheres, I think I've said that it's once more not a symmetrical but an asymmetrical arrangement, not just between two dispositions, that of the left and right hemispheres towards the world, but between a disposition, that of the left, that sees the two positions as an antagonism that must ultimately lead to the triumph of one and the annihilation of the other, and a disposition, that of the right, that sees that they need to be preserved together, neither being allowed to extinguish the other, even though they're not of equal value. So the right hemisphere needs to be the one that superintends the actions and reinterprets them of the left hemisphere. And William James said, looking back on my own experiences, they all converge towards a kind of insight to which I cannot help ascribing some metaphysical significance. The keynote of it is invariably a reconciliation. It is as if the opposites of the world, whose contradictoriness and conflict make all our difficulties and troubles, were melted into unity. Not only do they, as contrasted species, belong to one and the same genus, but one of the species, the nobler and better one, is itself the genus, and so soaks up and absorbs its opposite into itself. And a final joke, and then I'm going to sign off. One time I was listening to Radio 4 and I heard the late lamented Jonathan Sacks telling a story about a pious Jewish man who was reading the Talmud. And in it, he found that one of the great voices, the great rabbis of the past, highly esteemed rabbi, said that on no account must you do X. Later, he came across another rabbi who said, you must always do X. And so being confronted with this conundrum, he did what any pious man would do. He prayed to God and he said, which should I believe? Which is true? And God said, both of them are true. And slightly exasperated, he said, but they can't both be true. To which God replied, all three of you are correct. I like that. Anyway, there you go.